I do want to talk about Meghan's new podcast, Confessions of a Female Founder, because that also dropped this week. Now, TV critics were fairly brutal about With Love Meghan. And from what I've seen so far, it's a similar sort of scenario with this first episode of the podcast. Have you guys heard it? What did you think of it?
I thought that it's interesting if you're interested in Meghan. You know, if you're somebody who loves Meghan, you get to find out some little bits and pieces about her life. She reveals that she had preeclampsia or postpartum preeclampsia after one of her pregnancies. We don't know which one, maybe both, who knows. So if you're interested in Meghan, it's basically a celebrity podcast. If you're fascinated by Whitney Wolfe Herd, you already know who she is and you want to hear everything she has to say about the world, then that's the interest in it. But it's not actually a business podcast. And you know, there was one bit that kind of blew my mind because I don't really know much about Whitney Wolfe Herd and I don't know much about Bumble, which is the dating app that she set up. But she made this kind of off-the-cuff remark saying, you know, there was a point at which the share price for Bumble, her company, reached its lowest. And she was fine with it because she realised, you know, she was wealthy on the inside because of all the things.
Lighter.
She felt lighter and, you know, all the things that were making her happy in her life, like her family and so on. But I then looked up the share price for Bumble and it's like, it looks like a cryptocurrency pump and dump scheme. It was trading at $75 a share in February 2021. It's now $4 a share. So in other words, if you invested 75 grand in Bumble in February 2021, you'd have 4 grand now. So, like, the fact that Meghan didn't ask any follow-up questions, like, what is that? Is there a salutary lesson there? Like, is this a cautionary tale about how not to run a company, or do we not need to care about share price? In which case, what do we think of the stock market collapse that's happening right now? Like, there's so much to unpack there from a business point of view, but because it's actually, like, the podcast is actually about their emotional relationship and friendship, and so they don't get into any of that, which would have been fascinating to hear, actually. Yeah.
That's what I was going to ask. So what do you take away as the purpose of this? Because she did say it's going to be about taking you sort of behind the curtain and showing you how to build a business. So from what you're saying, my understanding, you don't think it's done that?
It's got nothing to do with how to build a business, really. Like, there's a couple of small bits of advice. Like, Whitney Wolfe Herd says, don't sweat anything that you're not going to care about in 5 years' time. So fine, you know. But, so Meghan, it was true throughout Archetypes. Like, she doesn't want to pressure her guests at all, probably because many of them are her friends. She probably already knew exactly how Whitney Wolfe Herd feels about the complete disintegration of her share price because she's Whitney Wolfe Herd's friend. But we don't know, and she doesn't ask pressing follow-up questions because it's so softball. But if she wants people to be genuinely interested, this podcast could have been way better. Like, to whatever extent it did have some interest and some intrigue, it could have been way better if she'd gone more into, like, interrogating the subject. I mean, the episode was called The Evolution of the Entrepreneur. There's nothing in there about the evolution of the entrepreneur.
Well, I don't think she can press any of her guests, mainly because they're her friends, but also I just don't think there's much substance going on upstairs. I mean, seriously, I don't think...
But you can hire people for that, like hire a producer to tell
But then you have to
ask.
admit that there's nothing in your head. I mean, this is the... So Meghan and people like Whitney who kind of move in the same world, and you can see they're very similar. They have this very romanticized view of, like, what a business owner is and what a female business owner is, as if you get, like, extra brownie points. And yes, of course, I listened to the whole thing and I didn't learn a single business lesson, which I find quite frustrating. There are loads of business podcasts out there that don't teach anything about business or starting a business or anything. I mean, I kid you not, at some point during the podcast, they talked about bottling up your essence and selling it. And that is the stuff of making...
Going to pop up on As Ever, the website?
I mean, it's just... It sounds like vagina candles all over again, a la Gwyneth
but vagina candles sold Goop. Like, vagina candles launched Goop.
It
wasn't a mistake. It was marketing brilliance, but there's nothing anywhere near as, like, interesting or lively as vagina.
But that's because it was controversial. I don't think bottling essence, there's no controversy around that.
It didn't really smell very much, thank God. I thought it was just going to smell like off sardine. But I think, ultimately, what Meghan is eventually going to have to realize is, yes, you tune into stuff because you want to learn about her, but there is not much to learn. She's very vacuous. She has a problem with word salad, I noticed. Maybe it's a California thing. But there's really not a lot of substance, to the extent that when she brings on someone who's actually done a lot with her own career and has had an interesting story to tell, she manages to make it as bland as humanly possible. And you really don't understand how. This is why I think, actually, stepping outside of the royal family was probably the best thing for her. Because when you are a member of the royal family and you're basically an ambassador for so many issues, you really have to get into the thick of it, and you really have to understand everything that you're doing. Princess Anne, for example, is she's well known for being very well researched on all the sort of charities she's a patron of. She's very well versed in the issues that she is basically representing. Meghan doesn't have any of that. It's all just, you know, bottling your essence and being happy and not stressing, and just there's strength in being yourself. The magazines publish things about me, but you know, there's strength in being yourself, as if you are not making money because the media are reporting on it.
An incredible impersonation, by the way. I was transported for a moment to Montecito.
Bottle your essence. And I was telling H.
This is the funny thing, is that if she actually leaned into the subject, then it would take all this pressure off her to be this incredibly captivating, interesting, exciting person, because we do care about business. And, you know, she's leaned into this very niche, narrow element of it, which is being a female founder of a new company, you know, which is quite a narrow definition. But actually, like, loads of people invest in the stock market. You know, there's ways that you can expand that subject of business out and make it bigger. But this was one of the things that was so jaw-dropping to me about the Bumble share price issue, which is that Meghan is an investor. Like, people forget that, but Meghan has invested in various companies. So she's sitting there. She is the equivalent of the person who invested 75 grand in Bumble and lost all the money. Like, what does she think about a chief executive sitting there saying it doesn't matter that the share price crashed?
Well, she clearly has no understanding of business. Bear in mind, I hate to remind everyone, this is an actress. Like, she didn't train as a chemist or as a doctor or as an engineer. She is an actress. So I think it's fair enough to say, to not have high expectations of her intelligence. That being said, did you catch in the podcast when she said, "Oh, you know, you're trying to start a business, but Archie's going to potty training"? And I was like, wait, what? What do you mean going to potty training? Are there like schools in Montecito where you send your children to be toilet trained?
Oh gosh, it took us a solid years for.
I clocked that. I was very shocked by it because I'm like, surely not.
I guess she must mean maybe he's like crawling around.
That's interesting. Well, maybe we did get a little bit of a personal detail in there.
They send their children to has mindfulness training. I mean, I kid you not, mindfulness training for a bunch of toddlers is hilarious to me. But that was one of the things they insisted upon.
So more broadly, so based on, I've taken on board your reviews. They do seem to be quite in line with the reviews I've seen elsewhere as well regarding the podcast. Off the back of archetypes, with the Spotify deal collapsing in quite a dramatic way a couple of years ago, do we think that Meghan is going to manage to push through with this podcast? Do you think that this will be her big podcast comeback, or do you think she's failed to land the plane?
I think this isn't going to be her big podcast comeback, but it could be a necessary step on the way for her to realise that she has to push herself harder and do more. I think there's a bit of complacency that's creeping into the Sussex camp, where they went in all guns blazing, largely pointed at the monarchy. They did the whole royal bombshells thing. Ultimately, it destroyed their reputation, so they had to stop. They then stopped and realised they had to do something that was more comfortable, and they wound up with something very vanilla. So they've done incredibly dramatic but toxic. Now they're doing boring but safe, and they need to find a way, but also a motivation to push themselves into more daring television or podcasts that isn't a fight with the monarchy. And they need something to drive them there. And so I think Meghan has to go through this phase of things that don't quite land in order to summon from within herself the motivation to leave the house and not just monetize her own life. Because I think that's basically what she's doing. She's trying to monetize her, like, she's got a little home farm which she's using to make crudité boards for the kids, and someone's turned around and said, "Oh, this is so wonderful, you make the best crudité boards." And she's like, "I'm gonna make it into a TV show." It's like, you can't do that. Like, you know, your life, your millionaire lifestyle is not interesting enough to people who are struggling for you to just monetize your own life. You have to push it. You have to leave the house. You have to push yourself out of your comfort zone. And what I actually think she should do is sit across the table from people who disagree with her, because no royal family member has ever done that.